Hello, welcome to FX PhD. My name is Matt Leonard and this is mya222, Maya Foundations Look Dev and Development, and we are in class number 2. So in this class we're going to start our first main project, which is going to be looking at lighting an object based on a background plate. Now this is something that's going to happen again and again if you're doing lighting for a feature film, for a commercial, for a TV show, even a corporate job, something like that. And so what I want to do is really go through and show you how you set that up and then the process you go through to light that. Okay, so this is the plate we're going to be using. This was shot by Mike and Jimmy over in the Australia office, and you can see that it's a shelf that has some space for us to put our CG object on. You can also see that we're going to have to deal with shadows being cast onto the shelf, and we're also going to need to deal with reflections. So we've got a number of different things that we need to look at. Once we've got that sorted, we've got the render done, we're going to do a very quick slap comp inside a Nuke just to show how we would do that. And then right towards the end of the class, we're going to do a whole class on deep compositing and deep slap comps that will also just kind of expand what we would have done in other classes this term. Okay, if we just drop out of full screen viewing here in Nuke, you can see that here we have our setup. And we have a number of different things that would have been done if you were in a larger company by different departments. But I'm going to show you how to do all of them here, just in case you're like a one-man band or a small company, or just interested in knowing how the process works. So right at the top, we have obviously the plate coming in. Now, if you're in a larger company that's working with a color pipeline for an entire movie, the chances are you'd have had your background plate shot with a Macbeth chart, and you would need to do some kind of grading of that background plate to kind of bring it into a correct color space based on things like 18% gray and things like that. Now, we don't have a color chart for this, so we're just going to not do any grading on the background plate at all. We're just going to keep it as it is, but we're going to make sure that some other elements that we're going to bring in are graded correctly to this plate, but we'll get onto those in a minute. So the next thing that would need to be done, if I just hit play on this, you'll see immediately that we have a camera move. So this is going to require some form of 3D tracking. So I'm just going to pause this and just open up this so you can just see what I've done. I'll just talk you through it. I basically came in, and for this, because I didn't really have anything too much to work with, I actually ran the image analysis. Now this works by basically tracking the shot, or what looks like tracking the shot. You end up with a whole bunch of 2D markers all over the plate, and then from that it works out how much distortion needs to be removed from the plate. So if I just show you that and then turn the lens distortion on and off, you can see there, especially on this side, you can really see it, and over here as well. Obviously lens distortion takes place mainly on the edges where you have the barrel distortion from the lens, but you can see it's made quite a difference. Now we need to remove the lens distortion from the plate before we do the camera track, because the camera track is assuming that the plate and all the lines on it are straight. And obviously if you have curved lines at the edge of things like buildings, or in this instance a shelf, it's going to affect how the camera track takes place. And it's the camera track that we're actually doing next. So if I just zoom in here, you can see that we have our camera tracker, and this was just set up reasonably straightforwardly. I came into first the settings and I upped the number of features. I dropped the threshold down here, the detection threshold, mainly because I was getting a lot of points here in the yellow background and I wanted to get rid of those. And I also brought the feature separation down, and that basically means that the points clump together if you bring that value down. So the rest of it I left as is, and then I came in and I did a track. Once the track was done, you can come in if you want, and you can come to settings and you can adjust some things in here. So I kept it on a free camera and I didn't really make any other changes. Then I ran the solve here, and that gave me quite a nice 3D track. So you can see, here's my 3D track here. And these points at the top, these are the top of the book, and these are the words on the side of the book. So you can see those words there. Now the only thing I had to do from there was come into scene, and I just rotated the scene around, moved it around just to get it nice and neat and square. I didn't really do anything else. Normally you would want to come in and adjust the scale, but I've left it as is for the time being. So we're going to end up with quite a small scene. Probably I ought to increase this, but for the time being I'm just going to leave it at 1. If you knew the width of this shelf here, you can actually measure this in Nuke and then adjust the scale based on that measurement. So if you knew the shelf was, say, I don't know, say half a foot or a foot across, then you could put that into Nuke in millimeters or centimeters, and it will scale the whole scene up. So that can be really useful if you're trying to get a scene to be the correct size. But for what we're doing, this is going to be just fine. So once the track was done, the next thing to do was to test it. And the way I did this was just to use the FXPHD logo, and I dumped that on top of this kind of checkerboard blue background that gave me this. Now I distorted this just so that it looked okay against the perspective of the shot, so that the FXPHD logo didn't look distorted, but probably you should keep it the right distortion here or the right aspect ratio, and then if the camera distorts it because it's looking at it from an angle, then I guess so be it. But that then got put on a card, and you can see here is my card in 3D space. And then that just got placed on the geometry that we have here, and that's aligned correctly in the scene based on my camera track. So you can see there's my camera, and if I unhide my point cloud, you can see there that's what it looks like. So if I just come down to my scene, here's my camera obviously, and that's moving quite happily. And then if I come down to my scanline render, you can see there is everything. And if I just view it, there is my tabletop with my FXPHD logo. And the idea behind making this simple piece of geometry was really just to make sure that everything was lining up. So I tend to turn off my point cloud, I don't need that. And then I simply took that and I laid it over the top of the background plate that gave me that. Now in order for the background not to run over the books, and if I just pull this off, this mask, so you can see my background runs over my books here, I did a straightforward roto. So you can see, if I just move this panel across, there's my roto, and that lines up with my books. And then once the roto was done, I just used the roto as a mat here to hold out the CG against the live action plate. And that then gave me my final image. So if I just play that through, as it begins to go through, you can see that we've got a really good track, no problems at all there. Okay, so you can just see that running through, and we've got a nice steady track. That's not perfect, but for what we need, we just need something here that's going to capture the shadows and reflections. It doesn't need to be perfect. So next up, we needed to add in a couple of things that I asked Mike to photograph. Now usually when Mike would go on set and do any on-set work, he would usually take these with him, and I just wanted to make sure that he gave them for the shot that we were going to work in, which he did. So what he did was he took a chrome sphere and he took a grey sphere. Now what these obviously do is show you the lighting conditions of the environment. So you can see he's placed the grey sphere and the chrome sphere directly on the table where he knew I wanted to put the CG object. And what we're seeing with this is we're getting a really good representation as to where the lights are. So we can see we've got a couple of lights in the ceiling. You can actually see Mike right there. There's Mike. Here's the camera that was taking the shot. And then we have sunlight coming through this window on the side. So we've got a main light source here, some light source here in the ceiling, and then as we go down the hallway, there's actually more lights down there. But most of the lights are either coming through this window or coming from these shots here. So this is really helpful just to help us to understand and visualize what's happening with the lights. The grey sphere is also really useful because, again, it helps us to understand what's going on with the diffusion of the lighting. So these are 18% grey spheres, 18% grey colour, and we can clearly see that we have a highlight here. It's not very strong, but it's coming in here, and this is almost certainly coming from the window. And then we also have a slight highlight here coming from the lights, and then as we come around to this side, you can see the illumination of the bounce of the yellow. So we get an awful lot of information just from this, and these two spheres are going to be really important for us as we begin to light this scene. So how did I get these into the plate? Well, let me show you the final look. So this is what I ended up with, and this would be quite normal if you were doing kind of feature film lighting. You basically take your spheres and you put them just here, or sometimes at the bottom of your background plate, so the lighters can create a chrome and a grey CG sphere and actually use those as an initial setup for the lighting. So what you're looking to do with the chrome CG sphere and the grey sphere is to actually try and balance and match the lighting that we're seeing in these live action spheres that we know were placed on the shelf. And theoretically, once you get the lighting of these correct, you've really got yourself quite a long way to getting the overall lighting sorted out for the entire shot. But we'll get into that a little bit later. Firstly, let's just have a look at how I've got them here. So if I just move our composite down so we can see what's going on. First thing I've done with our chrome sphere is I've just cut it out from the square. So I've just done a straightforward roto around it, nothing special going on there. I've output the roto to the alpha, and then I've done a pre-multiply based on what should be the RGB. So that is RGB pre-multiplied by the alpha. Then I've done a grade on this based on the color. So before we had this section of the wall here, and if I hide the grade and just view this, you'll see that at the moment we've got a discrepancy. Now the reason we have a discrepancy is for a whole number of different reasons. One, we're using a completely different camera to capture this. So obviously we used a film camera or the red camera or whatever Mike used to do the live action. And then this was almost certainly taken with something like his Canon 5D or something like that. And so you're going to get that discrepancy in the fact that you're using different color spaces, different gamuts, different setups, but also the fact that he shot the plate and then maybe he had to take a phone call, maybe some things happened, time would have gone by, the lighting would have changed outside, and therefore we would get a different illumination to kind of the entire scene. So our job is to take the chrome and the grey sphere and basically color grade them into the film plate, because the film plate, the background plate, is the key thing that we want. That's what is going to end up being shown in the cinema. That's what the client's going to see. They don't really care about the color of the spheres. They care about the color of the original plate. So the spheres are color graded into the plate. So the way I did that was I simply used a grade node, and I found that I could do a multiply up. So I did a multiply by 3.55, and then I did a very slight gamma with an increase in gamma in the red and the green and slightly less in the blue. And then obviously our alpha just needs to remain at 1. So once that's done, you can see if I turn it on, we get a really nice match. Now there's obviously lots of different ways to match things into a background. I found for this instance the old traditional way of looking at the red, green and blue were the best ways to match. So I basically matched red, green and blue separately, and that gave me a pretty good match here that I was happy with. If I put the roto back on, that then just chops out the background, and if I view that, just make sure that this is still set, we get a nice image. Then I did the same thing here for the background. So you can see that I have a grade node here. Seem to have added one by accident, so I'll just get rid of that one. So firstly, we have our original grey sphere. I then did a roto again. And you can see there's just a little bit of the corner of the book there. I'm going to leave that in there. I thought about maybe painting it out, but I thought even if I paint it out, what's going to be in this gap won't be completely realistic, and I might actually then get fooled into thinking that that's what the lighting's meant to be here. So I've left that there just so it's very clear. I can't see it, so I shouldn't worry about it. I've then done another grade, which I'm going to turn off for the moment so you can see the difference, and then transformed it into position. So you can see here I have the grey and the chrome next to each other. If I turn off the roto, you can see again the discrepancy in the background, and this piece of wall is clearly the wall behind it. So again, using the grade node, very similar technique. If I just close that up, this time I did everything with the multiply, but you can see again I did one value 1.1 for red. This needed a little bit more, 1.16 in the green, and then 1.12 in the blue. And again, that was matched once I put it on, so you can see it, to the red, green and blue, and that seemed to work out just fine. Maybe the blue's slightly off, but I was pretty happy with what I got in the end. So again, the roto goes on that then, and we're ready to go. So this plate is now ready to use for our background plate for lighting. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to need to put our object in here and begin to add our lights. Now, there's obviously different ways of doing this. What we're going to do for this shot is we're going to just use straightforward area lights to do everything. We're also, though, going to add an HDR that Mike was very kind to have taken for us. So let me just show you the HDR that he shot. We just go full screen on that. It's 4000 pixels by 2000, and that's usually the aspect ratio for a lat long. And you can see if we put on our clip warning and exposure, you can see that we have high dynamic range images in our ceiling lights and also in our sun area here. So again, we're just going to turn that off. And let's first of all come and look at our ceiling lights here. So you can see if I move my cursor around and we actually begin to stop down, you can see all that detail there. You can actually see the tubes there. You can see we're getting values around about 4.0. Now if we use something like our pixel analyzer, so let's just come in and grab that. So pixel analyzer, and I'm just going to float this, scale it down. Now this works really well. We can actually use this by doing shift, control, drag, and you can see the maximum value is 4.2, 4.3 and 3.5. So we're getting really good values there. We come across to our sun. These are going to give us even better values. So if we grab all of this area, you can see our maximum value now is 15.9, so nearly 16 in the red, green and blue. So really good dynamic range for the sun here, and also for the lights. Now sometimes you may have even greater dynamic range, so I can give you an example of something that's even higher. So if I just load in one that I have prepared earlier. If you've done other classes with me, you may have seen this before. This is shot at Tinton Abbey in the UK when I used to live there, and you can see that the sun here, if we come and draw around here, again bring in our pixel analyzer, and you can see for this one we have values of 102 or 121,000. So this is hugely bright, this one. Okay, now this has actually been doctored to try and get it as bright as this, and the reason why we wanted this one as bright because we wanted to get very, very harsh shadows. And if you remember from last week from the diagram I showed you, the difference between the blue sky and the sun was huge. I think the sun was something like 100 million above something like 500, which the blue sky was. So it really is this much brighter. So in the image that we have here, we just bring this up again and we just view that, you can see the sun here actually could go a lot brighter, and we may choose to come in later and actually change that So it wouldn't be unusual to just kind of maybe roto this shape here and add a really bright white highlight. And the way you would do that is we would just add a roto node, and we would just roto around this really roughly. So we would just come in here and we would just come around like this. Obviously it's behind the clouds for some of it. So something like that. And then we may, if we just look in the alpha channel, just choose to feather this a little bit, something like that. And then we can take this value that we've got here, just reset the viewer back. We can take this, and where the color is, we can increase the color. So we could say something like 1024, a number that we know and love. So now when I move my cursor over here, you can see that we're getting values really high once we change this from alpha to RGB. So we come back to here, just drop out of this, and now you can see color really ramps up to 1000 there, and that's going to give us really strong highlights, and you can see those here. The sun is obviously quite low, so this was shot kind of early in the morning or late in the day, but even these kind of values would be really useful to us. So I'm going to save this just like this so that we have this when we come to use it a little bit later. So from here we're just going to take this setup and we're going to load it into Maya. So I'm going to save out the 3D setup just to a FBX or a Limbic, and then load that into Maya. So we have the camera moving, and we have our rough piece of geometry that will know where to place our CG object. And I'm going to render out our background plate along with our spheres here, and we're going to be using that as our reference. So let's go ahead into Maya and just make sure they're all loaded. Okay, so here we are inside of Maya. So we have exported everything from Nuke, the camera, the point cloud, the tabletop, and the HDR, along with the background plate. So let's load our Maya scene. So in it comes. So you can see here we have this lovely teapot from Pixar, and I'm going to be using this even though I'm going to be rendering with Mental Ray for this project. Obviously this has come from the community website of Pixar, and the website was kind of set up in response to the fact that Pixar have now released their non-commercial version, which doesn't have any watermarks. It works exactly like the standard one does. In fact, it works fantastic, and everyone who has Maya or even Blender now can go in and download it and use it. So it's really great. I'm sure everyone who is doing this course has already downloaded it, but if you haven't, please go ahead and download RenderMan and get as much out of it as you can. It's a fantastic renderer and has really dominated the rendering of 3D over the years for decades now. So the fact that everyone can get hold of it is great. So unfortunately, we're not going to be using RenderMan for this example, but we are going to be using RenderMan for a lot of the course. I just wanted to start with something that everyone would have, which would obviously be Mental Ray. Now, if I look through my camera, what we'll be able to see is we'll be able to see that we have our teapot on our table. We also have a chrome sphere and a grey sphere, and these are going to need to be textured. In fact, everything just has the Lambert texture on for the time being. So let me show you what happens if we take the HDR that I've made inside a Nuke, the one that has the higher dynamic range that goes up to 1024 for the sun, and we render this scene using it. What we're going to get is something that looks like this. Now you can see it was quite a long render. It took 12.5 minutes to render this, and it still isn't entirely smooth. There's definitely a little bit of noise on some of this stuff here. Also be aware that we're going to need to build at some point stand-in objects for our books on this side and our books on this side, and they're going to take some kind of shadowing that we're going to be finding is falling on our teapot, just because these are obviously blocking the light to some degree. But for the time being, this is looking great. We need to make sure that our teapot is clearly on the table, and what we'll then do is we're going to add in the shaders that we're going to use for the chrome and grey sphere, along with a set of shaders for the teapot. And we're just going to be using standard mental ray shaders, probably the mix material shaders for those. So we know what that looks like. Again, all it's using is the HDR. All other lights are turned off and not used or not even placed in the scene at the moment. Okay, so let's just switch back to our perspective view, and let's just make sure this is definitely on the floor or on the table. Looks like it wasn't quite there, so I'm just gonna push it through very slightly, so that should be fine. So from here, let's go in and just load our hyper shader, and that's obviously under the render editors. So it's going to come in and it's going to be new and pretty exciting. So let's just bring that into the area of recording. So here you can see we have a bunch of shaders. We have our wrist shader. I'm going to delete that. We're not going to need that for the time being. We then have our first Lambert, our second Lambert, particles, and the glow shader that obviously you're going to use if you're doing any form of lens flares or anything like that, but most of the time you're going to want to do that inside a nuke. You can also see in here that we have a bunch of different shapes, and we're going to go with a teapot just because we like teapots. We also have a number of HDRs that we can use. So we have interiors and exteriors, and as I adjust those, you're going to see that change, and the reflections and shading on the teapot will also change in here. So the first thing we need to do is we need to basically make a shader for our chrome and for our grey. So I'm going to do that by just going with this untitled section here. I'm going to call this chrome. So I'm just going to hit tab and I can type MIA, and I want MIA material X. In fact, I might go with X passes just for safety, and you can see we get everything we need here. So we have our MIA material X and our MIA material shading group here. Now we're getting a really nice view here. Shame it's not the Pixar teapot, but they probably weren't able to use that. And what we want to do is we want to open up this, and we want to come in and we just want to choose chrome. So I'm going to replace this with chrome, and you can see now that renders really nicely. So this is a massive advantage over what we had before. Okay, so that is our chrome. I'm going to make a new one here, and I'm going to come in, and this one I'm going to make the MIA material X again, and on this one we're going to come in and we're going to just go with really just a flat color. So there's all types of things we can look at. We're probably going to be interested in this matte plastic. Color wise, we want to go with an 18% grey. Then we want to come into our reflection, and we want to turn that off completely. No glossiness, no glossy samples. So that should end up with just a straightforward matte 18% grey. And our roughness, I'm going to put at 0.8. Okay, so that is going to become our grey sphere. Then I'm going to come in and I'm going to make the teapot. Now there's a huge number of teapots that Pixar have very kindly made and given away. Anyone that knows anything about the Pixar teapots, there's always a huge line at SIGGRAPH, and they're always collector's items going for a huge amount of money for anyone who for some reason wants to sell them, but most people that get them keep them for sure. If you ever see any shots of Mike's main room, you'll notice that he has a whole line of teapots on the shelf behind him. What we're going to do is we're going to just make our own. So we're going to come in here. There's lots of different things in here. I'm going to go with something a little bit more unusual. So let's say a frosted glass look. Let's see what this one gives us. You can see we're getting a really nice result from that. Now I also want to make sure that the base is going to be a slightly different color. So I'm going to make another MIA material X, and this one we're going to go ahead and we're going to make maybe the base of it like a kind of a rubbery look. So there's our base, and there is our glass. So these are going to be our teapot. And what I should probably do is just make sure that I name all of these. So I'm going to name this one, and I'm just going to call this teapot main, and this one teapot base, and then in here this one is going to be called grey, and this one is of course going to be called chrome. So I can now close that down, and let's add them to this. So this first one is chrome, so right click, existing material. Unfortunately it's just off the bottom, but it does say chrome. This one, right click, existing material, and I'm going to go with grey. Here I'm going to grab this inside base piece just here, easier to maybe just grab it from here, right click, existing material, and teapot base, and then here right click, existing material, teapot main. So there we have a nice glass teapot, and you can see they've even modelled it with the legs extending into the main area of the teapot, which is exactly how it is if you are lucky enough to have one of these. So this should put us now in the ballpark. So what we're going to do now is we're going to re-render this just so we can see what it looks like. Okay, so the render's finished, and you can see straight off the bat that I actually changed the material. I went from the frosted glass, to this plastic colour. I was finding the frosted glass was just taking way too long to render, and I didn't want it to take a huge amount of time for the work you're going to be doing. So I've just switched it to this kind of plasticky colour, because I also think it's going to be easier to actually see what's going on with the light. So the first thing that you'll notice is that in our chrome sphere, the actual HDR is in the wrong place. It needs to probably rotate round by 90 degrees, something like that. So that's going to be one of the first things we're going to need to do next. Also, the grey sphere is slightly brighter than the one taken on set, and that's probably expected simply because we upped our light so much, and we didn't really do it scientifically, we just increased the light. So we're going to need to drop that down in order to get these lights to be the same, or these greys to be the same colour. Now the next section that we're going to need to do on this, and I'm not actually going to do it in this class because it's taken longer to get to this point than I expected, is that we want to drop the HDR right down in brightness, so it's really just giving us general ambience, and then we're going to basically use a couple of area lights, 3 area lights, to create the lights above and also the light out of the window, and we're going to basically relight this scene just with the area lights. Now you can see that we're really getting, with the HDR, a really good match straight off the bat, which is what you would expect, especially once the whole HDR is rotated round slightly so that these match, and you would expect them to be slightly off to begin with. So I'm going to actually finish the class here simply because I want to give the next stage more time than we've got, and I'm really trying to keep these classes down to kind of 30, 35, 40 minutes, and the next section is going to take a little bit of time. So we're going to, next week, we're going to come in and we're going to add the area lights and begin to get this looking great based on those area lights, and then once we've got that far, we'll then take this through to the final stages. So we've got ourselves in a good place. It's looking great with the HDR. We've got everything in place. Nuke is all set up, and we've put everything into place that we need. We can see if we come in here and just go real size, everything's looking nice and clean. And so next week we'll be able to take this through to the next and final stage. So if you want to take these files and kind of carry on yourself, go ahead. I'm just going to add, as I said, a couple of area lights for the ceiling lights here, and another area light for the window light, and then see what we need to do from there. We want to try and get these spheres as close as we can, and it's quite bright here at the front simply because, as you know, the window is right kind of in front, and once it's round we'll begin to get the highlight here, which is what we need. So any questions on all of this, please let me know, either obviously to do with what we've done in Maya so far or the big setup we did at the beginning with Nuke, and I will get onto those as quickly as I can. And as I said, if you want to take this through to final, even now, go ahead and do that, and then let's talk about what that looks like. I'd be very happy to kind of critique your lighting. So until next week, I hope you've enjoyed this, and as always, this has been Matt Leonard for FX PhD.